An alien scientist tried to examine the human's strength but ended up needing his help. The hiss of the containment chamber venting its sterile air sounded like the breath of some great, resting beast. Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his jumpsuit, his muscles straining against the fabric as he stepped into the bright, white-walled lab. The room was a maze of glowing consoles, floating holographic data streams, and curved machinery that seemed far too advanced for any human hand to have built. He scanned the room, his gaze falling on her. Dr. Kezri, the lead scientist of the Exorolith delegation, was nothing short of mesmerizing. Her tall, willowy frame was wrapped in a shimmering, silver bodysuit that hugged her lithe figure, the material shifting and catching the light like liquid metal. Her skin was a deep, iridescent violet, faint bioluminescent swirls moving like galaxies over her arms and shoulders. But it was her eyes that held him captive, large, almond-shaped, and a crystalline cyan that seemed to pierce into the core of him. "You're late, human," she said, her voice smooth but tinged with an edge of impatience. Her hands, with their long tapered fingers, moved over the holopanels in front of her, manipulating layers of data that Ethan couldn't begin to comprehend. "Traffic in spaceports tends to get a little backed up," Ethan replied, his tone casual but laced with a smirk. He approached her workstation, his boots echoing on the sleek floor. "So what's the experiment you couldn't wait to drag me into?" Kezri didn't look up, but her lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "Your species claims to possess remarkable strength despite a lack of advanced physiology. I intend to measure this strength under controlled conditions." She finally met his gaze, her head tilting slightly. "Though I suspect your confidence in your abilities may be exaggerated." Ethan raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest. "Careful, Doc. You challenge a guy's pride like that, and you might just end up impressed." "Doubtful," she retorted, gesturing for him to step toward a sleek, circular platform at the center of the room. The device hummed faintly, its surface shimmering with an unearthly energy. "Stand there. Remove unnecessary garments." Ethan blinked. "Unnecessary garments." Kezri's expression remained serene, though there was a faint flicker of something in her eyes. Amusement? Annoyance? "Your upper clothing? I need unrestricted access to observe muscle contractions during the examination." With a shrug, Ethan peeled off his jumpsuit's top half, exposing a physique honed by years of labor aboard freighters and outposts. Kezri's gaze flicked to his torso, her cyan eyes narrowing slightly as if analyzing every tone and contour. Ethan noticed her glance linger a little longer than strictly professional, but she quickly turned away. "Let's begin," she said, her voice a touch softer. The platform beneath Ethan's feet pulsed as Kezri tapped a series of commands into her console. A translucent energy field enveloped him, and tiny orbs of light floated around his body, scanning him with faint hums. Kezri watched the data stream on her holographic screens, her usually composed demeanor shifting as her brow furrowed. "You're producing higher readings than anticipated," she muttered, half to herself. "Your muscular density is impressive for an organism without bioengineered enhancements." "I'll take that as a compliment," Ethan quipped, flexing his arm. "You want me to show off a little more?" Kezri's lips pressed into a thin line, but the faint glow on her cheeks betrayed her. "Your arrogance is noted. Now, let's test your maximum output." She activated a series of devices that hovered around him, offering resistance as he pushed, pulled, and lifted. Each time, Ethan met her challenge with ease, his movements fluid yet powerful. Kezri's fascination grew with every test, her gaze shifting from her data to his form more frequently. Her scientific curiosity was giving way to something more primal, though she fought to suppress it. "Your species is intriguing," she admitted, finally stepping closer. Her hand hovered near his shoulder, as if debating whether to touch him. "There's a rawness to your power. It's unrefined but compelling." Ethan grinned. "Careful, Doc. You're starting to sound impressed." Before she could respond, an alarm blared, and the room's lights shifted to a flashing red. Kezri spun toward her console, her fingers flying over the controls. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, stepping off the platform. "Security breach," Kezri said sharply. "One of the containment units in the adjacent lab has been compromised. We must." The door to the lab hissed open, and a towering, insectoid creature burst through. Its exoskeleton gleamed under the flashing lights, its mandibles clicking as it advanced on them. Kezri froze, her usually calm demeanor shattered by a flash of panic. "Stay behind me," Ethan ordered, stepping between her and the creature. His instincts kicked in as he grabbed a metal rod from a nearby workstation. The alien lunged, but Ethan met its charge head-on, using his strength and quick reflexes to evade its snapping mandibles and deliver a crushing blow to its thorax. The creature screeched, staggering back. Kezri watched in stunned silence as Ethan fought, his raw power and determination on full display. He moved with a mix of brute force and calculated precision, his every strike purposeful. The creature lashed out again, but Ethan caught one of its legs and wrenched it off with a sickening crack. Finally, with a powerful swing, he drove the rod into its head, and the alien collapsed in a lifeless heap. Ethan turned to Kezri, breathing heavily. "You okay?" She nodded, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "You saved me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, well, you're welcome," he replied, brushing off his hands. "Guess my strength isn't so exaggerated after all, huh?" Kezri stepped closer, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for something. "You risked your life for me. Why?" Ethan shrugged. "Seemed like the right thing to do. Besides, I couldn't let anything happen to my favorite scientist." Her lips curved into a rare smile, and before Ethan could react, she reached out, her fingers grazing his cheek. Her touch was warm, electric, and it sent a jolt through him. "Your species is more than just physically intriguing," she murmured, her gaze locked with his. "You're remarkable." Ethan chuckled, his voice low. "Is this the part where you admit you're impressed?" Kezri didn't answer with words. She closed the distance between them, her lips brushing against his in a tentative, exploratory kiss. Ethan froze for a moment, surprised, but then he leaned into her, his hands finding her waist. The kiss deepened, their contrasting textures and heat igniting a spark that neither of them could deny. Her arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer as their bodies pressed together. The faint glow of her bioluminescence pulsed in time with her quickening breath, and she let out a soft, almost musical sigh. Ethan's hands roamed over her back, the smooth, cool fabric of her suit heightening the sensation of her beneath his touch. "Kezri," he murmured against her lips, his voice husky. "If this is part of the experiment, I think I like where it's going." She pulled back slightly, her cyan eyes glowing faintly. "This isn't in the protocol," she admitted, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "Then let's rewrite the rules," Ethan said, his grin returning. The faint glow of Kezri's bioluminescent skin dimmed as she stepped back, her breathing shallow and her gaze darting between Ethan and the inert alien on the floor. Her usually composed demeanor was fractured, her body taut as though wrestling with an internal conflict. Ethan studied her carefully, noting the way her fingers trembled before she clasped them behind her back. "That wasn't just adrenaline, was it?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but probing. He didn't move toward her, giving her space to process whatever was racing through her mind. Kezri's eyes flicked to his, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I acted impulsively." Unprofessionally, she turned sharply, facing the console as though its flickering data streams offered some reprieve. "This breach must be reported immediately. There are protocols." "Don't do that," Ethan interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "Don't brush this off like it didn't happen." He stepped closer, careful to keep his movements measured. "You kissed me, Kezri. Maybe it wasn't in your protocol, but it sure as hell wasn't meaningless." Her shoulders tensed, and for a moment he thought she might push him away entirely. Then she sighed, a sound that seemed to deflate her usual stoicism. "You don't understand, Ethan. My people. We don't indulge in such actions lightly. Physical connection, emotional connection is rare. It requires trust. It complicates things." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowing. "Complicates how?" Kezri hesitated, her fingers hovering over the holopanel as if stalling for time. Finally, she turned to face him again, the glow along her neck and cheeks faint but steady. "Among the Zerolith, forming such a bond is binding. It's not something we can abandon once it's begun." The weight of her words hung heavy between them. Ethan studied her, the edges of his usual playful smirk softening into something more serious. "You're saying this isn't just a casual thing for you?" "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her glowing eyes locked onto his, searching for some sign of understanding. "And now I fear it may distract us from the mission at hand." Ethan took another step forward, closing some of the space between them. "Look, I get it. This is new territory for both of us. But what just happened back there that wasn't a distraction? It was real. And as far as I'm concerned, we can figure out the rest as we go. Kezri opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a shrill chirp from her console interrupted. She spun back to the display, her fingers darting across the controls. Ethan leaned over her shoulder, his body close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from her skin. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. Kezri's expression darkened as she scanned the data. "There's another breach. Multiple containment units in the lower levels have been compromised. If the specimens escape the outer facility, the entire colony is at risk." Ethan frowned. "Is this sabotage?" "Possibly," Kezri replied. "This level of failure across independent systems is unlikely to be a coincidence. We need to act quickly to contain the threat." Ethan straightened, his jaw tightening. "Then let's suit up. Where do you keep your weapons?" Kezri cast him a sideways glance, her lips twitching into a faint smile, despite the gravity of the situation. "You're remarkably quick to volunteer for dangerous scenarios. Do all humans possess such reckless bravery?" "Not bravery," Ethan said with a shrug. "Just a stubborn need to keep people alive. Especially you." Her cheeks flushed faintly, the glow intensifying for a brief moment before she turned back to the console. Armory access is restricted to personnel with proper clearance. However, she tapped a few more controls and a hidden compartment in the wall slid open, revealing a sleek, alien weapon. It was a smooth, black device that hummed faintly with energy as she handed it to him. "Try not to destroy the facility with that." Ethan grinned as he hefted the weapon. "I'll do my best. So what exactly are we up against?" Kezri led him to the lab's exit, her stride purposeful despite the tension in her shoulders. "The specimens in the lower levels are far more dangerous than the one we encountered here. Many are apex predators from their respective ecosystems, and most possess traits that make them highly resistant to conventional methods of control." "That's a long-winded way of saying they're tough as hell," Ethan noted, keeping pace with her. "Good thing you've got me." Kezri glanced sideways at him, her expression softening. "Yes, I suppose I do." The corridor outside the lab was eerily quiet, the flashing red lights casting long shadows across the metallic walls. Kezri's fingers danced over her wrist-mounted holo interface, pulling up a map of the facility. "The breaches are concentrated in sublevel 3. If we can reach the control room there, we may be able to re-engage the containment fields." Ethan nodded. "Lead the way." They moved quickly but cautiously, the silence around them broken only by the occasional distant crash or hiss of venting steam. The deeper they descended into the facility, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The hum of machinery grew louder, almost drowning out the faint, unsettling sounds of movement in the shadows. As they reached the entrance to sublevel 3, the door's control panel sparked and flickered, clearly damaged. Kezri frowned, examining the controls. "It's been sabotaged. The manual override will take time." Ethan stepped forward, gripping the edges of the door. "Or we could do this the old-fashioned way." With a grunt, he forced the heavy metal door open, his muscles straining against its weight. Kezri watched with a mixture of amazement and concern, her hands hovering near her weapon as she scanned the dimly lit corridor beyond. "Impressive," she said quietly, her tone carrying an uncharacteristic warmth. "Perhaps your strength isn't exaggerated after all." "Glad you're finally catching on," Ethan replied, flashing her a grin. They stepped through the opening, their weapons at the ready. The corridor beyond was dark, the emergency lighting casting a faint, flickering glow. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something metallic, a tang that made the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stand on end. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice low. Kezri nodded, her free hand brushing against his arm as they moved forward. The touch was brief but grounding, a silent acknowledgement of the trust they had begun to build. Together, they advanced deeper into the sublevel, their senses on high alert. The first attack came without warning. A massive reptilian creature lunged from the shadows, its talons scraping against the floor as it charged. Ethan reacted instinctively, raising his weapon and firing a burst of energy that struck the creature square in the chest. It roared, the impact staggering it but not stopping its advance. Kezri's weapon hummed as she joined the fight, her shots precise and efficient. "Aim for the joints," she called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. Ethan adjusted his aim, targeting the creature's legs. The combined assault forced it to collapse, its momentum carrying it into a wall with a bone-rattling crash. It let out one final, guttural cry before falling still. "Good call," Ethan said, glancing at Kezri. "You've got a knack for this." She arched an elegant brow. "I suggest you save the compliments for after we survive." "Fair enough," he replied, though the grin on his face didn't fade. They pressed on, encountering more of the escaped creatures as they neared the control room. Each battle brought them closer, not just to their goal but to a deeper understanding of each other. Kezri's precision and analytical mind complemented Ethan's raw strength and quick thinking, their partnership evolving into an unspoken rhythm. Finally, they reached the control room, its reinforced door standing between them and the facility's last hope for containment. Kezri began working on the access panel, her fingers moving with practiced speed. "Ethan," she said without looking up, her voice softer now. "Thank you. For everything." He glanced at her, his expression serious. "We're not done yet, Doc. But I'll take the gratitude. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" she asked, pausing to meet his gaze. "When this is over, we figure out what this thing between us really means." Kezri hesitated, then nodded, a faint smile curving her lips. "Agreed." The door slid open, and they stepped into the control room together, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Ethan and Kezri stepped into the control room, their boots thudding lightly against the reflective metal floor. The room was circular, lined with tall panels displaying streams of holographic data. At the center, a console pulsed faintly, its interface active but flickering in a telltale indication of tampering. The subdued lighting cast long shadows, giving the space an eerie, foreboding atmosphere. Kezri's fingers immediately flew to her wrist-mounted controls, her luminous cyan eyes scanning the readouts. The containment fields are still offline. If we can reroute power from the auxiliary grid, we might be able to restore them. Ethan paced toward the central console, his eyes sweeping the room. "Might? That doesn't sound too reassuring, Doc." Kezri shot him a sharp look, but the corner of her lips twitched in what might have been a faint smile. "It's a more promising outcome than the alternative." Her expression turned serious again as she approached the console. "I'll need you to hold off any further threats while I work. This system has been deliberately sabotaged. Undoing the damage will take time." Ethan nodded, gripping the alien weapon Kezri had provided earlier. Its design was unfamiliar, but its functionality was simple enough: aim, fire, and hope for the best. "Don't worry," he said, his voice steady. "I'll handle anything that comes knocking." Kezri tilted her head slightly, her gaze lingering on him. "You're remarkably calm under pressure. It's unusual." Ethan smirked, his tone laced with humor. "Is that your way of saying you're impressed?" Before she could respond, a low, guttural growl rumbled from the corridor behind them. Ethan immediately turned, raising his weapon. "Guess I'll have to wait for that answer." The growl was soon joined by the scrape of claws against metal, and the shadows outside the room shifted as multiple shapes moved toward the doorway. Ethan squared his shoulders, planting himself between Kezri and the encroaching danger. "Focus on the console," he said over his shoulder. "I'll buy you all the time you need." Kezri hesitated for a fraction of a second, her luminous gaze flicking to him, before she nodded and bent over the controls. Her fingers moved with precision, pulling up layers of corrupted data as she worked to bypass the sabotage. Behind her, the room filled with the tense hum of energy weapons charging. The first creature burst into the room, its elongated body covered in segmented, chitinous armor that gleamed under the dim lighting. It let out a piercing shriek, its four glowing eyes locking onto Ethan. Without hesitation, it lunged. Ethan fired a burst of energy, the recoil vibrating through his arms as the shot struck the creature's torso. It screeched in pain but didn't falter, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Ethan sidestepped at the last moment, using the alien weapon like a club to slam into its side. The force of the blow sent the creature skidding across the floor, but two more immediately took its place. "Little busy here," Doc, Ethan called out as he fired another round, the energy blast searing through one of the new attackers. The smell of scorched exoskeleton filled the air, acrid and sharp. "I'm aware," Kezri replied, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. "Keep them away from the console. I'm isolating the corrupted pathways now." Ethan gritted his teeth as a third creature leapt toward him, its serrated limbs slicing through the air. He crouched low, letting it sail over him, before spinning and firing a well-placed shot into its exposed underbelly. The creature collapsed in a heap, but more shadows moved in the corridor beyond. "Any chance you can work faster?" Ethan asked, his voice strained. "I am working as fast as I can," Kezri retorted, her tone clipped. Despite the tension, Ethan caught the flicker of determination in her voice. She wasn't about to let the situation overwhelm her. The next wave of creatures was larger, their forms more grotesque. Ethan's weapon hummed as he fired burst after burst, each shot taking down another enemy. But the sheer number of attackers was beginning to wear on him. His muscles burned, his reflexes slowing as exhaustion crept in. One of the creatures managed to slip past him, its razor-sharp limbs scuttling toward Kezri. Ethan reacted instinctively, throwing himself between her and the attacker. The creature's claws raked across his arm, the pain sharp and immediate, but he ignored it. With a fierce roar, he grabbed the creature by its segmented neck and slammed it into the floor, finishing it off with a point-blank shot. Kezri's head snapped up, her eyes widening as she took in the blood seeping from his wound. "You're injured," she exclaimed. "I'm fine," Ethan grunted, shaking off the pain. "Just keep working." For a moment, Kezri hesitated, conflict flashing across her face. But then she turned back to the console, her focus sharpening. The glow of her bioluminescent patterns intensified, spreading up her neck and across her temples as she poured her energy into the task. "The auxiliary grid is almost online," she said. "Hold them off a little longer." Ethan nodded, tightening his grip on the weapon. His movements were slower now, each swing and shot requiring more effort, but he refused to back down. The thought of Kezri in danger was enough to keep him standing, his determination overriding the fatigue threatening to drag him down. The creatures seemed to sense his weakening resolve, their attacks growing bolder and more coordinated. One of them managed to knock the weapon from his hands, its claws slashing toward his chest. Ethan caught its arm, struggling to keep its razor-sharp appendage from reaching his throat. His vision blurred, the edges darkening as his strength began to wane. And then a flash of cyan light filled the room. Ethan blinked, disoriented, as the creature was thrown back by a pulse of energy. Kezri stood behind him, her hand extended, the glow from her bioluminescent patterns pulsing in rhythm with the energy emanating from her palm. Her usually composed expression was fierce, her eyes blazing with determination. "Stay down," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument. Ethan staggered back, his legs threatening to give out, as Kezri unleashed a barrage of energy blasts. The creatures shrieked and scattered, their forms disintegrating under the onslaught. Within moments, the room was silent once more, the only sound the heavy breathing of the two survivors. Kezri rushed to Ethan's side, her hands hovering uncertainly over his wound. "You're not fine," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You've lost too much blood." Ethan managed a weak grin. "Guess I'm just stubborn like that." Kezri's expression softened, her glowing fingers brushing against his arm as she began to assess the injury. "You're more than stubborn. You're infuriatingly selfless." "I'll take that as a compliment," Ethan murmured, his eyelids growing heavy. Kezri's brow furrowed as she reached for a small device on her belt, pressing it to his wound. A cool sensation spread through his arm, dulling the pain and slowing the bleeding. "Stay with me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I need you." The vulnerability in her tone pulled Ethan from the edge of unconsciousness. He forced his eyes open, meeting her gaze. "I'm not going anywhere, Doc." She let out a shaky breath, her fingers lingering on his arm before she turned back to the console. "The containment fields are back online," she said after a moment. "The remaining specimens should be neutralized shortly." Ethan leaned back against the wall, his body heavy but his mind sharp. "Good. Then we can figure out who's behind this mess." Kezri nodded, her expression hardening. "Yes, and when we do, they will regret underestimating us." Despite the pain and exhaustion, Ethan couldn't help but smile. Now that's the spirit. Kezri glanced at him, her lips curving into a faint smile of her own. For the first time, the tension between them seemed to ease, replaced by a mutual understanding, a bond forged in the fires of danger and trust. "Rest for now," she said softly. "We have much to discuss, and much to prepare for." Ethan closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together. The faint hum of the containment field vibrated through the floor as it reactivated, sealing off the corridors and neutralizing any remaining threats. Kezri lingered by the central console, her glowing hands still hovering over its interface as if hesitant to release control. The sharp lines of her face were softened by relief, though a shadow of tension remained in the set of her jaw. Ethan leaned against the wall where she'd left him, his arm bandaged with a strip of fabric she'd torn from her own suit. The bleeding had stopped, thanks to the alien med tech she'd used, but his body still felt heavy, worn from the fight. He watched her in silence for a moment, studying the way her bioluminescent patterns pulsed faintly in the low light like a visual echo of her thoughts. "You did it," he said finally, his voice breaking the stillness. It carried a mix of admiration and exhaustion. "Containment's back online. The colony's safe." Kezri turned to him, her cyan eyes catching the dim light like polished gemstones. "Not entirely," she corrected, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. "We've stabilized the immediate threat, but whoever orchestrated this breach is still at large. They may try again." Ethan pushed himself off the wall with a grunt, his muscles protesting. "Then we find them. Whoever they are, whatever they want, we make sure they don't get another chance." Kezri's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. Her fingers flexed, and for a moment it seemed like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she crossed the room to him, her steps measured and deliberate. "You shouldn't be standing," she said, her voice soft but firm. Her hands hovered near him, not quite touching, as though unsure of the boundaries between them now. "Your injury may be stabilized, but you've lost blood. Rest is necessary." Ethan smirked, brushing off her concern with a wave of his hand. "I'll rest when we've got answers. Besides, I've had worse." Kezri frowned, her glowing patterns dimming slightly. "You have an alarming disregard for your own well-being." "Comes with the job," Ethan replied, his tone light but with an undertone of sincerity. "When you spend enough time in the outer colonies, you learn to roll with the punches. Or the claws, in this case." Kezri's frown deepened, and she stepped closer, her gaze scrutinizing him. "That mindset may have kept you alive, but it's reckless. You risked your life for me back there." Ethan met her gaze, his smirk fading into something more serious. "I'd do it again, Kezri. And not just because it's the heroic thing to do. You're not just another person to me." Her breath hitched imperceptibly, the glow along her neck and cheeks intensifying. She looked away, folding her arms across her chest in a gesture that seemed more defensive than composed. "You don't understand what you're saying," she murmured. "To my people, bonds like this are irreversible. Once formed, they cannot be undone." Ethan tilted his head, his brows knitting together. "You're talking about that connection we were starting to feel back in the lab. The kiss. The way we, I don't know, synced up during the fight. That's not something your kind takes lightly, is it?" "No," Kezri admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "For the X-Relith, physical and emotional connection are intertwined. They are not fleeting. They are permanent." Ethan let her words settle for a moment, the weight of them sinking in. "And you're worried I don't get what that means. That I'll back out once I realize it's not just a casual thing." Kezri's silence was answer enough. Her eyes flicked to his, searching his face as though trying to decipher his thoughts. "Look," Ethan said, taking a step closer to her. The movement brought them within arm's reach, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. "I don't pretend to know everything about your culture or what this bond means. But I know how I feel, and I know I don't want to walk away from whatever this is." Her lips parted slightly, her expression softening. "You're certain?" Ethan nodded, his voice steady. "Yeah, I am. But that doesn't mean we have to figure it all out right this second. Let's take it one step at a time, starting with finding the bastard who nearly got us both killed." Kezri studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Agreed. One step at a time." The journey back to the upper levels of the facility was uneventful, though the silence between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Kezri led the way, her movements precise and efficient, but Ethan could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. She was still processing everything that had happened, everything they'd shared. When they reached the main operations room, the facility's lead administrator, a stocky human named Vendrace, was already waiting for them. His face was pale, beads of sweat glistening on his brow as he paced in nervous circles. He stopped abruptly when he saw Kezri and Ethan enter. You're alive, he said, his voice a mix of relief and incredulity. Thank the stars, we've been trying to re-establish contact with Sublevel 3 ever since the breach. Containment has been restored, Kezri informed him, her tone clinical. But the sabotage was deliberate. Someone within this facility is responsible. Drace's face paled further. Sabotage? Are you certain? Ethan crossed his arms, his gaze hard. Dead certain. The systems were too cleanly cut for it to be an accident. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Drace swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously. This is a disaster. If word gets out that we had a breach. Your public relations concerns are irrelevant, Kezri interrupted sharply, her glowing eyes narrowing. The priority is identifying the saboteur and ensuring they cannot repeat their actions. Drace flinched under her gaze, nodding quickly. Of course. I'll have security begin a full investigation immediately. Good, Kezri said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned to Ethan. We'll need to cross-reference personnel access logs with the timing of the breaches. If there are any anomalies, they should point us to the culprit. On it, Ethan said, stepping to one of the nearby consoles. His hands moved over the controls with surprising ease, his years of experience in spaceports and outposts giving him an edge in navigating alien tech. As he worked, Kezri joined him, her fingers brushing against his briefly as she adjusted one of the displays. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a ripple of warmth through Ethan. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, catching the faint flicker of cyan light along her neck. She didn't look at him, her focus remaining on the data, but he couldn't help but notice the way her lips tightened as though suppressing a smile. Hours passed as they combed through the facility's records. The saboteur had been careful, covering their tracks with precision, but together, Ethan and Kezri began to piece together a trail of anomalies, access codes used at unusual times, power fluctuations in areas that should have been dormant, and finally a name, Arlen Vex, one of the facility's senior engineers. He's been rerouting power to unauthorized areas for weeks, Kezri said, her tone cold. And his access code was used to breach the containment units in Sublevel 3. Drace paled further, his hands shaking as he wrung them together. Arlen? But he's been with us for years, he wouldn't. He did, Ethan cut in, his voice hard. Question is, why? What's he got to gain from all this? We'll find out soon enough, Kezri said, straightening. Drace, where is Arlen now? The administrator stammered, glancing nervously at his own console. I don't know. He hasn't checked in since the breach. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then we'd better find him before he makes his next move. Kezri nodded, her cyan gaze meeting his. Agreed. Let's end this.